The Empire had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. They had conquered more than 2,000 worlds and destroyed every species that refused to kneel before them. Their warships were massive things of black metal and burning engines that could block out the sun when they passed overhead. No civilization had ever survived their arrival. No species had ever fought back and won. Admiral stood on the command deck of his flagship and looked at the small blue planet on the viewing screen. Earth, the natives called it, a tiny world orbiting an ordinary yellow star at the edge of an unremarkable galaxy. His sensors told him everything he needed to know about the creatures living there. They were soft. They were fragile. They had only recently learned to leave their own atmosphere. They were children playing with toys while the adults of the universe watched and laughed. He had done this many times before. The process was always the same: arrive in overwhelming force, broadcast the ultimatum, watch the primitives panic and beg for mercy, then begin the cleansing. It was efficient. It was clean. It was how the Empire maintained order across the stars. On Earth, a young man named Ben Carter was working the night shift at a monitoring station deep in the mountains of Colorado. He was 26 years old and had been doing this job for 3 years. Most nights were boring. He would watch his screens, drink coffee, and wait for his shift to end. But this night was different. This night would change everything. The first anomaly appeared at 11 minutes past midnight, a small blip at the edge of the solar system that his equipment could barely detect. Ben leaned forward and adjusted his instruments. The blip became 2 blips, then 10, then 100, then so many that his screen turned white with contacts. He called his supervisor immediately. Colonel was a serious woman in her 50s who had spent her entire career preparing for something everyone told her would never happen. When Ben showed her the readings, her face went pale. She picked up the red phone on her desk and began making calls. Within 1 hour, every government on Earth knew what was coming. Within 2 hours, the leaders of every major nation were gathered in an emergency video conference. Within 3 hours, General Brooks was standing before them with a grim expression on his weathered face. Was 62 years old. He had fought in 3 wars and had seen things that still haunted his dreams, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. He looked at the faces on the screens around him: presidents and prime ministers, kings and generals, all of them looking to him for answers he did not have. The fleet numbered 800 warships. Each one was larger than anything humanity had ever built. Each one carried weapons that could turn cities into glass and oceans into steam, and they were coming straight for Earth with no sign of slowing down. The broadcast came 12 hours after the first detection. Every television and radio and phone on the planet suddenly showed the same image: a tall creature with gray skin and black eyes staring into the camera with absolute contempt. It spoke in a language that somehow translated itself into whatever tongue the listener understood. Surrender unconditionally within 72 hours. Open your cities to our forces. Accept your place as servants of the Empire, or face complete annihilation. These were the only options presented. There was no negotiation offered. There was no mercy promised. There was only submission or death. The world erupted into chaos. Some people screamed and cried and held their families close. Some people prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Some people rioted in the streets and looted stores and acted as if civilization had already ended. And some people got very quiet and very calm and began to prepare. Watched the reactions from his command center buried deep beneath a mountain in Virginia. He had known this day might come. He had spent his entire career knowing it, and unlike the panicking masses on the surface, he knew something that gave him hope. Earth was not as defenseless as it appeared. Arrived at the command center 6 hours after the broadcast, she had been briefed on things she never knew existed. She had seen plans and weapons and technologies that made her question everything she thought she understood about her own species. And now, she stood beside and looked at the screens showing the approaching fleet. "They are so confident," she said quietly. "They think this will be easy." Nodded slowly. Every bully thinks that way until someone punches them in the mouth. Across the planet, other people were having similar conversations. In a research facility hidden beneath the Nevada desert, a woman named Laura was gathering her team. She was 51 years old with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had seen too many sleepless nights. She had spent 20 years building weapons that the public would never know about, weapons designed for exactly this scenario. In orbit behind the moon, Commander was waking his crews from their long sleep. His station had been waiting in silence for decades. His ships had been hidden and ready and hungry for a fight that everyone hoped would never come. Now it was here, and he felt something he had not felt in years: purpose. The fleet continued its approach. Admiral reviewed the scan data with growing boredom. The humans had primitive nuclear weapons and chemical rockets and satellites that could barely maintain their own orbits. They were no threat. They were not even a challenge. They were simply the next name on a very long list of species that would be erased from existence. He gave orders to his fleet. Standard cleansing protocol. Start with the largest population centers. Make an example that would break whatever spirit these creatures might have. It was the same approach that had worked on 2,000 worlds before. Back on Earth, Brooks received reports from every corner of the globe. Hidden facilities were coming online. Secret weapons were being activated. Men and women who had trained their entire lives for this moment were taking their positions. The trap was being set. The 72-hour deadline approached. The expected surrender or chaos. They expected begging and pleading and the pathetic whimpering of a doomed species. They expected what they had always received from every world they had ever conquered. But humanity had no intention of surrendering. Humanity had no intention of begging. Humanity had chosen a third option that they had never encountered in 10,000 years of conquest. Humanity had chosen to fight. And the Empire had no idea what was about to happen. The Nevada desert had always been a place of secrets. For decades, people had whispered about strange lights in the sky and hidden military bases and technologies that the government refused to acknowledge. Most of those whispers were dismissed as fantasy, but some of them were true. Some of them were more true than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Laura walked through corridors that did not officially exist. She passed through security checkpoints that would not appear on any map. She descended into levels of underground facility that had been carved from solid rock over 30 years of secret construction. And when she finally reached her destination, she stood before machines that could reshape the very fabric of reality itself. Project Sentinel had begun in 1969, the same year humans first walked on the moon. A small group of scientists and military officers had looked up at the stars and asked a simple question: what if we are not alone? What if something is out there? And what if that something is hostile? The answers they developed were kept from the public. They were kept from most governments. They were kept from anyone who did not need to know. And over 5 decades, those answers had grown into something extraordinary. Laura gathered her team in the main control room. There were 47 people in this facility, and every single one of them had been waiting their entire careers for this moment. They were physicists and engineers and soldiers and dreamers. They were the best humanity had to offer, and now they had less than 60 hours to save their entire species. The first system to come online was called the Beam Array. 27 satellites that appeared on no registry and showed up on no radar. They had been placed in orbit over a period of 20 years, disguised as space debris or hidden behind the moon or simply made invisible by technology that most scientists would have called impossible. Each satellite contained a directed energy weapon capable of punching through any known material. Together, they could turn the sky itself into a weapon. The second system was the gravity wells. Laura had spent 15 years developing these devices. They worked by creating localized distortions in spacetime, tiny artificial black holes that could crush anything caught within them. The physics behind them was beyond anything published in academic journals. The power required to operate them was beyond anything the public grid could provide. But Laura had solved both problems through sheer determination and brilliance. The third system was the fleet. Commander commanded 200 ships that had been built in secret facilities on the dark side of the moon. These were not the clumsy rockets that the public knew about. These were sleek and fast and armed with weapons that made nuclear warheads look like firecrackers. They had been waiting in the shadows for 50 years. Now they awakened. Stood on the bridge of his command ship and felt the engines hum to life beneath his feet. He was 48 years old with gray at his temples and scars on his hands from a lifetime of service. His second in command, Lieutenant Grant, stood beside him with her eyes fixed on the tactical display. 800 enemy ships, she said. We have 200. Smiled grimly. Numbers are not everything. Across the solar system, other preparations were. Hidden weapons platforms scattered among the asteroids began their power-up sequences. Defense satellites buried in the rings of Saturn came online. Dormant probes that had floated silent for decades suddenly activated and began transmitting targeting data. Humanity had been seeding the solar system with surprises for 50 years. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. On Earth, the visible preparations were equally impressive. Nuclear submarines surfaced in coordinated patterns across every ocean. Underground silos opened in deserts and mountains on every continent. Fighter jets scrambled from bases that were supposed to be abandoned. The entire planet transformed from a helpless target into a fortress. General Brooks coordinated everything from his command center. He stood before a wall of screens showing feeds from around the world. Russian commanders spoke with American ones. Chinese targeting systems shared data with European weapons platforms. Old enemies set aside centuries of conflict for this single moment. For the first time in history, humanity truly fought as one. They noticed none of this. Their sensors were advanced, but they were designed to detect known threats. They could spot a nuclear missile from 1,000,000 miles away. They could track a warship by the heat of its engines. They could analyze any weapon they had encountered in 10,000 years of conquest, but they could not see what they had never imagined. Admiral reviewed his battle plans with growing impatience. The humans had not surrendered. They had not even responded to the ultimatum. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Some species chose defiance over submission. It made no difference in the end. They all fell before the might of the Empire. He ordered his fleet to accelerate. Standard cleansing protocol would begin in 12 hours. The first targets were already selected. New York, Tokyo, London, Beijing, Moscow. The largest cities would be destroyed first. The message would be clear. Resistance was futile. Surrender was the only option. In the Nevada facility, Laura watched the enemy fleet on her monitors. She felt no fear. She felt no doubt. She had spent 20 years preparing for this moment. Her weapons were ready. Her team was ready. Humanity was ready. The countdown continued. 50 hours became 40. 40 became 30. The fleet crossed the orbit of Mars and continued toward Earth without slowing. They broadcast more demands. They promised mercy for those who surrendered quickly. They described in graphic detail what would happen to those who resisted. Brooks listened to every broadcast. He read every translation, and he said nothing in response. Let them talk, he told his staff. Let them believe whatever they want to believe. It will make the surprise even. Moved his fleet into position. His ships hid behind the moon, their engines cold and their weapons charged. His pilots sat in their cockpits and waited with the patience of hunters. They had trained for this. They had dreamed of this. And soon, very soon, they would have their chance. Grant ran final checks on every system. She found no faults. She found no weaknesses. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. They continued their approach. They counted down the hours until they would add another world to their empire. They planned celebrations for after the conquest. They discussed which officers would govern the new territory. They treated the invasion as a formality already completed. They had no idea that in the darkness between the stars, humanity was waiting, watching, preparing. The trap was set. The bait was in place, and they were about to learn a lesson that no species had ever taught them. Some prey fights back. The first warship entered Earth orbit at exactly 6 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. It was a massive vessel called the Conqueror's Pride, nearly 3 miles long and bristling with weapons that could glass entire continents. Its captain, a veteran of 50 planetary invasions, positioned his ship directly above New York City. 8 million humans looked up and saw their sun disappear behind a wall of black metal. The captain charged his main weapons. This was his favorite part of any conquest. The moment when the primitives realized their fate. The moment when hope died in their eyes. He aimed at the heart of Manhattan and prepared to fire. He never got the chance. The sky turned white. 27 beams of focused energy struck the Conqueror's Pride simultaneously. Each beam carried more power than every nuclear weapon ever built by humanity combined. The warship did not explode. It did not burn. It simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, blocking out the sun. The next moment there was nothing but empty sky and falling ash. Admiral stared at his tactical display in disbelief. One of his largest warships had vanished in less than a second. His sensors could not even tell him what had happened. There was no weapon signature he recognized. There was no technology he understood. There was only death, sudden and absolute. Before he could issue orders, the chaos began. Across the solar system, hidden weapons platforms activated. Defense satellites that had floated silent for decades opened fire. Particle beams and plasma cannons and weapons that had no names tore through the formation. Ships that had conquered 1,000 worlds found themselves under attack from directions they never expected. Commander led the counterattack personally. His ship burst from behind the moon at speeds they had never seen from human technology. 200 vessels followed him, each one piloted by men and women who had waited their entire lives for this moment. They hit the enemy fleet like a hammer striking glass. Targeted the nearest destroyer and fired. His weapons were not missiles or bullets. They were something new, something they had never encountered. Concentrated bursts of gravitational force that tore through armor like paper through water. The destroyer crumpled inward on itself and disappeared into a ball of compressed metal no larger than a car. Lieutenant Grant flew on his wing. She was 34 years old and had trained for combat since she was 18. She had memorized every tactic, every maneuver, every possible scenario. And now she put all of that training to use. Her ship danced through enemy fire with impossible grace. Her weapons found their targets with perfect precision. Every shot was a kill. On Earth, the ground-based defenses joined the battle. Missiles launched from silos on every continent. Not the slow, clumsy rockets they expected, but advanced weapons with engines that bent space itself. They crossed the distance to orbit in seconds and struck their targets before the enemy could react. General Brooks watched the battle unfold on his screens. He felt no joy. He felt no triumph. He felt only cold determination. This was not a moment for celebration. This was a moment for destruction, complete and total destruction. They tried to regroup. Admiral screamed orders at his captains, form defensive positions, concentrate fire on the enemy fleet, retreat to safe distance and reassess. But none of his orders mattered. The humans were everywhere. Their weapons came from every direction, and nothing in the arsenal could stop them. The gravity wells activated next. Laura had positioned them at key points throughout the battlefield. When she gave the command, they created pockets of impossible density that trapped anything within them. 3 cruisers were caught in the first activation. Their crews had just enough time to scream before they were crushed into nothing. A battleship tried to ram the human command station orbiting the moon, saw it coming and smiled. He gave a simple order, and a weapon that had never been used before powered up. A beam of pure darkness lanced out from the station and struck the battleship amidships. The vessel simply fell apart, every atomic bond in its structure breaking at once. It crumbled into dust and scattered across the void. The battle lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of constant violence and destruction and death. 3 hours in which 800 warships were systematically dismantled by a species they had dismissed as primitive. Admiral watched his fleet die around him. He saw ships that had survived 1,000 battles torn apart in seconds. He saw captains who had never known defeat crying out for mercy. He saw the pride of the Empire reduced to burning wreckage and drifting debris. He tried to retreat. Every surviving ship received the same order: jump to hyperspace, escape this nightmare, report back to the Empire. But the humans had anticipated this. They had calculated every possible jump coordinate. They had positioned countermeasures at every escape route. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. A young pilot named Chris Palmer spotted the Admiral's flagship trying to flee toward the sun. He was 23 years old, and this was his first real combat mission. But he did not hesitate. He pushed his engines to maximum and closed the distance in seconds. His targeting computer locked onto the massive vessel. He fired once. The flagship of the Third Armada split in half. Its reactor detonated in a flash of blue light. Admiral, conqueror of 100 worlds, died without ever understanding what had happened, without ever knowing how a species of soft, fragile, primitive creatures had utterly destroyed him. When the battle ended, not a single ship remained intact. 800 warships had been reduced to scattered debris orbiting Earth like a ring of broken metal. Human losses were minimal. A few damaged ships, a handful of wounded pilots, nothing more. Surveyed the battlefield from his command ship. Grant stood beside him in silence. Around them, the crew worked quietly, processing what they had just accomplished. "We won," said finally. Nodded slowly, but he did not smile. He knew this was only the beginning. The Empire would send more ships. The Empire would want revenge. The war was not over. It had just begun. The survivors numbered less than 50 ships. They floated in the darkness between Earth and Mars, their engines damaged and their weapons depleted. They were the remnants of the mightiest fleet the Empire had ever assembled, and they were begging for their lives. The new commander was a young officer named. He had been fifth in the chain of command before the battle. Now everyone above him was dead. He stood on the damaged bridge of his crippled cruiser and composed a message to the humans. His hands were shaking. His voice was trembling. He had never known fear before this day. The message was simple. The survivors wished to surrender. They would accept any terms. They would become prisoners. They would share all their knowledge and technology. They would do anything, anything at all, if the humans would simply stop killing them. The message was received in the command center beneath Virginia. General Brooks read it twice. Then he called a meeting of the United Earth Defense Council. Every leader who had authority over the response gathered within the hour. Laura argued for acceptance. She stood before the assembly and spoke of mercy. She spoke of how humanity had always valued compassion. She spoke of how accepting the surrender would show the galaxy that humans were better than their enemies, that humans could be cruel in battle but kind in victory. Religious leaders from a dozen faiths echoed her words. They spoke of forgiveness and redemption. They spoke of breaking the cycle of violence. They spoke of setting an example for other species who might be watching. An example of grace under pressure, an example of strength tempered by wisdom. Listened to all of them. He respected their opinions. He understood their reasoning. And then he made his decision. No surrender would be accepted. The room fell silent. Some faces showed shock. Some showed horror. Some showed grim satisfaction, looked at each of them in turn and explained his reasoning. They had destroyed over 2,000 civilizations. They had wiped out entire species without hesitation. They had come to Earth with the intention of killing every man, woman, and child on the planet. They had shown no mercy to anyone ever in 10,000 years of conquest. And now they wanted mercy for themselves. Asked a simple question: what message would it send if humanity accepted their surrender? That attacking Earth carried no real consequences. That you could try to wipe out the human race and face nothing worse than imprisonment if you failed. How many more fleets would the Empire send if they knew their soldiers would be treated well even in defeat? The council debated for 3 hours. Votes were cast and arguments were made. In the end, the military commanders were unanimous. The survivors would not be allowed to return home. They would not be allowed to share what they had learned about human capabilities. They would not be allowed to live. Commander received the order with mixed feelings. He was a soldier, not an executioner. He had fought enemies before and shown them respect in defeat, but he also understood the logic. This was not a normal war. This was a fight for survival against an enemy that knew no limits and showed no restraint. He gathered his pilots and explained the situation. Some of them protested. Some of them asked if there was another way. Some of them simply nodded and prepared their ships. In the end, they all followed orders, because they knew what was at stake, because they understood that sometimes mercy was a luxury that could not be afforded. Grant led the first attack wave. She targeted a damaged destroyer that was drifting near the asteroid belt. The ship had no working weapons. Its engines were dead. Its crew was sending desperate pleas for mercy on every frequency, ignored the pleas and fired. The destroyer vanished in a flash of light. 100 soldiers died in an instant. They had families somewhere across the galaxy. They had hopes and dreams and fears just like anyone else, and now they were nothing but atoms scattered across the void. The killing continued for 2 days. Human ships hunted down every surviving vessel. Some tried to hide among the asteroids. Some tried to play dead and hope the humans would pass them by. Some tried to make desperate runs for open space where they might find a way to escape. None succeeded. Chris Palmer, the young pilot who had killed Admiral, found himself struggling with what they were doing. He sat in his cockpit after destroying his third defenseless transport and stared at his hands. They were steady. They did not shake, but inside something felt broken. He spoke to about it during a brief rest period. She listened without judgment. She understood what he was feeling because she felt it too. This was not glorious combat. This was extermination. And no matter how justified it might be, it left marks on the soul. But she also reminded him of why they were doing this. She told him about the 2,000 worlds they had destroyed. She told him about the species that no longer existed because of creatures just like the ones they were killing. She told him that mercy was a gift, and gifts were earned through showing mercy to others. They had earned nothing but death. By the end of the second day, it was over. Every single ship from the invasion fleet had been destroyed. 800 warships and their crews had been erased from existence. Not one soldier would return home to tell the tale. Brooks stood in his command center and looked at the empty tactical display. The threat icons were all gone. Earth was safe. Humanity had survived. But he felt no joy. He felt only exhaustion and a deep, heavy sadness. He had ordered the deaths of thousands. He had refused mercy to those who begged for it. He had done what he believed was necessary to protect his species, and he would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. Laura found him alone in his office hours later. She did not condemn him. She did not praise him. She simply sat with him in silence and let him know that he was not alone. The universe had learned something about humanity that day, something important, something terrifying. Humans could be pushed to do terrible things when their survival was threatened. And once pushed, they did not stop until the threat was completely eliminated. No matter the cost, no matter the burden, no matter what it did to their souls, 5 years had passed since the day the sky turned white over New York City. 5 years since humanity had faced extinction and responded with overwhelming force. 5 years since the Empire learned that some species were not meant to be conquered. Earth had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible before the invasion. The secret technologies were no longer secret. The hidden facilities were no longer hidden. The truth about Project Sentinel had been revealed to the public, and after the initial shock had faded, people had embraced it. They had built wonders that the pre-invasion world could never have imagined. Dr. Laura stood on the observation deck of the Luna station and watched ships being constructed in the massive orbital shipyards. These were not military vessels. They were explorers, scientists, diplomats. Humanity was finally ready to take its place among the stars, not as conquerors or victims, but as equals. She was 61 now. The stress of the war years had added lines to her face and gray to her hair, but her eyes still burned with the same fire that had driven her through 2 decades of impossible research. And now she had new projects, new challenges, new dreams to chase. The United Earth Council had become the official governing body of humanity. Old nations still existed, but they worked together under a common framework that made the old conflicts seem petty and distant. General Brooks had been elected as the first Secretary General, a position he held reluctantly but dutifully. He was 72 years old and tired in ways that sleep could not cure. But he had one more task to complete before he could rest. The probe was called Messenger 1. It was small, about the size of a car, and it contained nothing but communication equipment and a power source that would last for 10,000 years. Its purpose was simple. It would travel to the heart of what had once been the Empire and broadcast a message on every frequency the dead conquerors had ever used. Had been promoted to Admiral and given command of the newly formed Earth Defense Fleet. He oversaw the probe's construction personally. He checked every system and approved every component. This message was too important to risk on faulty equipment. Grant was there for the launch. She was 43 now, with silver streaks in her dark hair and a rank of captain on her collar. She had trained a new generation of pilots in the years since the invasion. Young men and women who had grown up in a world where humanity was no longer alone in the universe. Chris Palmer had left the military 2 years after the war. The things he had done haunted him too deeply to continue. He had become a counselor, helping other veterans deal with the weight of what they had experienced. He was at the launch ceremony too, standing in the back of the crowd with his wife and young daughter. Brooks approached the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. Thousands of people had come to witness this moment. Millions more were watching on screens around the world. He cleared his throat and began to speak. He told them about the message the probe would carry. He told them about what it meant for the future of humanity. And he told them about the warning that would echo across the stars for generations to come. The message was recorded in every language that had ever used. It would be translated automatically for any species that intercepted it, and it would play on a continuous loop until the probe's power finally died, thousands of years in the future. Laura had helped write the message. So had and dozens of others who had been part of humanity's defense. They had argued over every word. They had debated every phrase. And in the end, they had created something that said exactly what needed to be said. The message began with an introduction. It spoke of a small blue world orbiting an ordinary yellow star. It spoke of a species called humanity that had lived there for thousands of years, building civilizations and creating art and dreaming of the stars. It spoke of a simple people who had wanted nothing more than to explore the universe in peace. Then it described their arrival in detail. The 800 warships, the demands for surrender, the promise of annihilation. It explained that they had conquered over 2,000 worlds and destroyed every species that resisted them. And then it described what happened next. The message included recordings of the battle, footage from ship cameras showing warships being torn apart, data streams showing the systematic destruction of the invading fleet, audio of commanders screaming for mercy that never came. It was brutal and graphic and left nothing to the imagination. The final part of the message was the warning. It was addressed to every species in the galaxy, friend and foe alike, and it spoke with a voice that carried the weight of 800 destroyed warships behind it. Humanity does not seek conflict. We wish only to live in peace and explore the wonders of the universe. We offer friendship to any species that approaches us with honesty and respect. We offer trade and cooperation and shared discovery. We offer the hand of fellowship to all who would take it. But we are not victims. We are not prey. We will not bow to those who demand submission. We will not surrender to those who threaten destruction. We will not show mercy to those who show none. The Empire sent 800 of their mightiest warships to conquer Earth. Not one of those ships survived. Not one of those soldiers returned home. The Empire that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years broke itself against our world like waves against stone. Let this serve as a warning to any who would follow in their path. Come in peace and be welcomed as friends. Come with weapons raised and threats on your lips and be destroyed utterly. There will be no negotiation. There will be no surrender. There will be only the same fate that befell The choice is yours. The probe launched on a clear morning with the sun rising over the Pacific Ocean. It accelerated away from Earth at speeds that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Within hours, it had left the solar system. Within days, it had entered the territory that had once belonged to the Empire. Brooks watched it go from the observation deck of the Luna station. Laura stood beside him. So did, and they were older now, all of them, by war and changed by victory, but they were still here, still standing, still protecting the world they loved. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the message would reach its destination. Somewhere out there, other species would hear humanity's voice for the first time. Some would listen with hope. Some would listen with fear. Some would not believe until they saw the debris field still orbiting Earth, the remains of 800 warships that had tried to conquer a species that refused to be conquered. And some, perhaps, would learn the lesson that they had paid for with their lives. Never underestimate humanity. Never threaten what humans love. And never, ever assume that a small blue world on the edge of the galaxy is helpless. Because it is not. And it never will be again.